Section 5.1. This section is all about chords and harmony. In here, you will see questions like this. Indicate suitable chords for the two cadences in the following melody by writing either 1, 2, 4, or 5 in each of the 5 boxes underneath the staves. In order to do questions like this, we first need to learn what chords are, and specifically triads. Triads are chords with 3 notes, and each of the notes is a third above one another. Let's take the scale of a D major as an example. If we put 2 notes on top of each of the scalic notes, and each of the notes are separated by an interval of a third, then these are all the chords we will have in a D major key. And we label them as follows. The first chord is labeled by the Roman numeral 1, and the second chord 2, the third chord 3, the fourth chord 4, the fifth chord 5, the sixth chord 6, the seventh chord 7, and lastly we're back to the 1 chord. In Music Theory Grade 5, all we need to know are chord 1, 2, 4, and 5, and they also happen to be the most common chords in Western classical music. The same labeling system also applies to all other keys, whether it's major or minor, and here we have an E minor key for example. And remember in chord 5, because chord 5s always contain the 7th note of a given key, in this case the D in the E minor, this 7th note will always be raised, and that's why here we have the D sharp instead of a D natural here. Having learned about what triads are, we can now move on to the concept of cadences. Cadences are specific chord progressions that indicate the ends of musical phrases. They are like punctuation marks in a language. At Grade 5 Music Theory, we need to learn 3 kinds of cadences. First, the perfect cadence, and in this cadence we have chord 5 followed by a chord 1, and that usually signifies the end of a musical phrase. And then we have what we call the Plagal cadence, in which we have chord 4 going to a chord 1, and similarly it also signifies the end of a musical phrase, and usually people would describe it as less strong than the perfect cadence. Lastly, we have the imperfect cadences, and they can be any chord progressions as long as the last chord is a 5 chord. So in our case, we have chord 1 going to chord 5, chord 2 going to chord 5, or chord 4 going to chord 5. Below I will show you a few examples so that you know how they sound in real music. The first is an example ending in a perfect cadence. Here is an example of Plagal cadence. Here is an example of imperfect cadence 1 going to 5. Here is an example of imperfect cadence 2 going to 5. Lastly, we have this example of an imperfect cadence with 4 going to 5. Having learned triads and cadences, we can now revisit this question. In this question of the exam, we are usually given a melody with 8 bars, and there are 2 cadences. The first one in the middle of the piece, and this will usually be from bar 3 to bar 4. And we'll have another cadence in the end of the music, and this usually means the last 2 bars. Although very often you will be given another bar somewhere else in the music in which you need to choose a chord to harmonize the melody as well. because this section usually contains 5 marks. In order to do this question successfully, we always need to figure out what key we're in first. Otherwise, whatever answers you pick will probably be all wrong. So it's always best to consult your key signature grid in cases like this. But this is a fairly straightforward question because we only have one flat and there isn't any accidentals in the music. So this definitely won't be any minor keys because there's no raised note at all. And with one flat, that means we have an F major in this case. And to start, we can first write out the 4 chords that we'll be dealing with in this key. That is the chord 1, chord 2, chord 4, and chord 5 in F major. And if it makes it easier, we can also write out the letter names. So for chord 1, we have F, A, C. For chord 2, we have G, B flat, D. For chord 4, we have B flat, D, F. And for chord 5, we have C, E, and G. As a general rule of thumb, what we need to do when harmonizing a melody with chords is to make sure that the melody itself contains most of the chord notes. Let's take the first box as an example. We have the note A, and then D, C, A, F. In this case, the F, A, C note seems to fit with our chord 1 the most, because in our chord 1 we do have F, A, and C. But now you may be wondering, what about the D note in this bar? Well, that's exactly what we need to learn as well, because in fact that's called a non-chord tone. In this case, it's called an Appoggiatura, which is something we don't have to learn at this stage. All we need to know for now is that this D does not belong to chord 1, because it's just for decoration purpose. It makes the music more interesting, but it's not a mandatory note from the perspective of the chord 1. In other words, it's just an optional note, a note that we can disregard when figuring out the harmony. And so in this case, the answer is the chord 1. In the next bar, we have the notes G, F, and E. And here we have another non-chord tone, which is the middle note, the F, and we call that a passing note because it merely decorates the melody so that it becomes a smoother and more connected line. But essentially, the chord notes are really just the G and the E. And according to our chord collections, where do we have G and E? Well, we have the G and E in chord 5. And this answer will be a chord 5. And this also makes it a progression from chord 1 to chord 5. That is an imperfect cadence. Now, in the third question box, we have the following notes: a B flat, a D, an E, and an F. Again, here we have another type of non-chord tone, and it's the E here, which we call an accented passing note, a note that lands on a downbeat but does not form part of the chord, because again it also just functions as a connecting note between 2 chord notes, which are, in this case, a third apart, the D and F. The difference between a passing note and an accented passing note is just that a passing note always lands on a weak beat, and an accented passing note always lands on a strong beat. And now, having disregarded the note E in this case, all that we should be dealing with are the note B flat, D, and F. And if we check them against the chord collections we have, these notes fall within the chord 4. And that's our answer. The next bar we have the notes G, A, G, and C. Here we have the last kind of non-chord tone that we need to know, and in this case is the note A, which we call an auxiliary note. It's a type of non-chord tone that goes away from the chord note and goes back to the chord note. So again, it's just a decoration to the melody to make it a more interesting line, but a non-essential note that we can disregard. In this case, the chord notes are then the G and the C. And according to our chord collection, the G and the C note fit with the chord 5 the most. And the answer is therefore a chord 5. Lastly, we only have one note, and this is quite common at the end of a piece of music. In this case, we have the note F, and now it seems we have 2 options. The note F can be found in chord 1 as well as chord 4. However, because we are asked to form a cadence at the end of this piece, we need to make sure that the chord that we choose will form a proper cadence, and that means the chord progression needs to be one of the progressions that we have learned. Does 5 go to a 4 chord? Not really, because that's not one of the cadences we have learned. But chord 5 going to chord 1 would work as a perfect cadence. And that's our answer here. And this is how you do this question. Remember, the top tip is that we should always figure out the key first before we even start doing anything. Because if you got the key wrong, then all the chords that you choose will be from a different key, and therefore the Roman numerals are all going to be wrong. So you just lose all the 5 marks here. So be really careful with this. Also, remember to figure out the non-chord tones from the chord tones, so that you are not confused or distracted by them, and really focus on the actual chord notes that you're harmonizing. All this takes a little bit of practice to get used to, but once you do, it will not just be smooth sailing going forward, but you'll also understand the music better, because you now speak the same language as the composers. If you're looking for some more practice, I'll highly recommend that you visit this interactive site where I've put together a lot of practice tests and mock papers with instant feedback. In the drill mode, you have access to all the questions section by section, so that you can focus on specific question types and practice them until you feel confident. There are virtually unlimited questions. In the exam mode, you have access to full papers in the exact format of the exam, with randomized questions each time. You have 2 hours to finish the complete paper, at the end of which you'll be given your score and feedback.